Next up, Chapter 7, Looking for a Home, read by Nina Horgan.
Chapter 7, Looking for a Home. The next morning I woke up and wondered where I was. Then I realized I was still lying on wet palm fronds on the muddy ground underneath the upside-down boat. Mama and Papa were both sleeping. Papa had one arm looped over a bench in the little skiff. Mama was curled up on the ground and covered with mud. Her clothes, which had once been white linen and nice fabric from the men's suits, were filthy and ruined. I realized that Mama and Papa must have held the boat almost all night through the entire storm. I crawled out from underneath the skiff without waking them up. I stood and looked around in amazement. Birds flew over the swamp and a cool breeze was blowing in from the northwest. There were a few high clouds, but it was sunny. The sawgrass had been pounding so loud the night before was standing up and waving in the gentle breeze. I couldn't believe it. The only sign that a hurricane had passed through was the swamp. The water was stirred up to a deep brown and bits of leaves and whole branches floated by. Papa woke up a few minutes later and joined me outside. He looked very tired. His eyes were red and the cut on his cheek was a big scab. His whiskers were growing out and his shirt was torn, but he was smiling. "That was some storm, eh, Charlie?" he said. "Yes, Papa, it sure was." "Well, now we can say we survived a hurricane. Not many people can say that." "I guess not." He thumped on the boat to wake up Mama, then announced it was time for him to leave in the skiff. We were out of food now, and we desperately needed to find a way through the swamp if we wanted to survive. I knew it could get serious if we were lost in the sawgrass. Tiger said that even Indians got lost in the swamp sometimes, and not all of them came back to the village. Mama and I stood on the bank and watched Papa row away again and disappear into the tall sawgrass. But this time he came back an hour later with the good news that the mysterious Haulover area between the swamp and the lake was very near. Even in the rain and dark, we had made our way to the edge of the Haulover. Once we reached the Haulover area, we had another problem. The lake was at least 300 yards from the end of the swamp. The 300 yards in between were all dry land. How would we haul the skiff over 300 yards of dry land? The Seminoles cut the wild pawpaw and used the stalks as skids, which they rolled their canoes over. But there was no pawpaw growing nearby. Papa decided to use brute force and just pull the skiff over the dry land. He did it in spurts of 20 or 30 yards at a time. By the time he reached the top of the lake, he was completely exhausted. He had not slept in more than 24 hours and had eaten only some uncooked fat pork and syrup the night before. Mama and I cheered when Papa finally pushed the skiff into the clear waters of Lake Worth. Then we climbed into the boat and Papa started rowing again. From the water, it was easier to see where the hurricane had destroyed trees, and I saw where one whole tree had been knocked over and was sticking up from the lake. It was filled with big white birds watching the water below. I had no idea where we were going, and Papa just kept rowing. I started to get hungry, but when I complained to Mama, she just said, "Hush now, we'll eat soon enough." "Where?" I asked. "Where are we going?" "Charlie, just let Papa do his work in peace." I could tell she was getting nervous again, and I tried to stop my stomach from growling, but it didn't work. Finally, we saw a house along the shore. Papa pulled the oars into the boat and rested for a minute. He shaded his eyes with his hand. "There it is," he said, grinning, "the Maldon house. I was beginning to think we'd never find it here, and we'd have to eat young Charlie here. He was starting to look pretty meaty to me." "Hey," I said, and Mama laughed. "Papa was just joking." I knew Mr. and Mrs. Maldon, but not very well. They had visited the lighthouse a few times while we lived there. That's how Papa knew where they lived. Soon enough, we had docked at their tiny dock, and Papa hailed them from the boat. Mr. Maldon appeared in the doorway, followed by Mrs. Maldon. I saw that their yard was a mess from the hurricane. A big tree had lost most of its branches, and it looked as if Mr. Maldon had spent the morning cutting them up with a handsaw and stacking the wood. Mrs. Maldon had tied a kerchief around her head and rolled her sleeves up like a man. She had been cleaning the walls of the house. The Maldons were really nice. They took us in a right way, and Mrs. Maldon went to the stove to prepare a quick meal. While we ate, they listened to Papa tell the story of hiding underneath the boat while the hurricane passed by. Mr. Maldon leaned back his chair and said, "Well, that's just the most incredible thing I've ever heard. Charlie, your Papa must be the luckiest man on God's green earth." I just nodded. I was very hungry, and I didn't see what was so lucky about getting stuck inside a storm anyway. We ended up staying with the Maldons for a couple of days while Papa recovered his strength. On the third day, we thanked the Maldons and set off down the lake in search of the best land to make our homestead. Several miles down the lake, we spotted a small cabin perched high in the overgrown jungle of the barrier island. We landed the skiff nearby and ventured up to the cabin, shouting, "Hello, is anyone home?" There was nobody. I later found out that the cabin had been built by a German immigrant named Augustus O. Lange. The legend was that Lange was living farther on the north coast of Florida when the American Civil War erupted. Being from Germany, he had no interest in the outcome of an American Civil War, but he was afraid he might get drafted into the Confederate Army and set up north to fight, as he had happened to lots of Irishmen who came to this country during that war. So, to avoid fighting in a war he didn't care about, Lange traveled down to South Florida and hid himself in the vast jungles. He lived alone in this cabin on the barrier island for years, growing his own fruits and vegetables, harvesting fish and oysters, and hunting wild game. As the legend goes, Lange lived so removed from civilization that when the American Civil War ended in 1865, he had no idea that the war was over. After all, there were no newspapers and no other people lived within miles of his cabin. In 1866, a family named Sears, who lived near Miami, had sailed north to Sand Point to purchase supplies. On their return voyage down the coast, they noticed that heavy rains had broken up open a natural inlet into Lake Worth. They sailed through the inlet to explore Lake Worth. To their great surprise, they found Lange living all alone like a hermit in his cabin. When Lange asked how the war was going, the Sears family told him that it had ended a year earlier. Shortly thereafter, Lange abandoned the cabin and moved north. He had successfully avoided the entire war. Now, we were thinking about moving into Lange's cabin. It wasn't nearly as nice as the lighthouse. The whole cabin was made of lumber that had probably been salvaged from a shipwreck. The roof looked just like a Seminole roof. It was made of dried palmetto fronds. There were a few empty bottles and cans littering the floor, and turtle shells, animal bones, and firewood were scattered around outside. "Well," said Papa. "I don't know," Mama said. "It's not very well kept, is it? And it's pretty small with just one room for the three of us." "Surely," said Papa, "there's not much room for a family here." Papa looked around a little more, then shook his head. "No," he said, "we can do better than this." So we sailed south once again. The lake was about 25 miles long, and we had explored only the first 5 or so miles. Over the next 2 days, we sailed all the way to the bottom of the lake looking for the best place to live.